Welcome to episode 26 of the Tax Professionals podcast. In this episode, I share with you 8 tax research sins. That is, 8 things that you should not do when doing tax research.
Welcome to the Tax Professionals podcast, the podcast dedicated to helping you improve your tax career. Here's your host, Jack Bonehill.
Tax research is easy, right? Can't you get the answer to any tax question from Google? You may think so, but don't be lured into a false sense of security, especially early on in your career. As we all know, tax is complicated and the rules should not be underestimated. Rather than take the typical episode approach of giving you tips on how to do something, in this episode I'm going to be doing the opposite. I'm going to give you the 8 tax research sins. These are all things you should avoid doing when doing tax research, as they increase the chance of you getting the wrong answer, providing incomplete advice, or are bad practice. All the sins mentioned in this episode are either things I've done personally or have seen others do. While it's intended to be light-hearted, I am sharing these with you so that you can avoid having to make these mistakes yourself. If you would like tips on how to undertake tax research effectively, then you can head on over to episode 1 of the podcast at thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/TTPP1. Make sure you don't miss out on any future episodes of the podcast that will help you to progress, develop and improve your tax career by signing up for email notifications at thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/subscribe. These will give you a brief summary of each episode so that you can decide whether you want to listen. Episodes are bi-weekly and are released on Mondays. Without further ado, let's get to it. The first sin is using random online articles from Googling. Now, this is one that I was guilty of when I first started working in tax. I mean, when you're asked a question, the first thing for most of us to do, particularly from my generation, is to go straight to Google and type in the question. When I first started working in my first tax job, I remember being asked to do a task where I needed to find out exactly what the managed service company legislation was so that I could let my manager know what the rules were, when they applied, etc. And what did I do? I went straight to Google. And I ended up on some random website, and that's the website that I ended up taking the answer from. Now, fortunately, in this case, the random website ended up giving the right answer, which is always a good sign, but it is something that you definitely shouldn't do and shouldn't be relied on. Anyone can upload content to the internet now. I mean, Bob down the pub, who seems to know everything about tax without ever working in it, could literally just go, make a website, post something online, and there you go, there's an article online about tax. Not only that, but things can also become out of date very easily, so when you're using articles from random websites, they could have been done 5-6 years ago, and whilst they may have been correct at the time, then now they might not be, because as we know, the rules change pretty regularly. Also, articles that are written by other people and put online are usually done in some form of marketing aspect, and so they tend to be overly simplified and do not give the full picture. So whilst you may be able to get some idea of what the right answer is, you might not be able to fully understand all the scenarios and how the rules will act differently for a different scenario. So whilst using Google and using random articles can be a good starting point, when trying to find the answer to something that you have no idea what the answer is, do not rely on that only. Once you've found what you think the answer is, always back it up with a credible resource such as HMRC guidance, legislation, or some other form of guidance like Tolley's guidance, but basically make sure it's credible, make sure it's in date, and make sure it gives the full picture. The second sin is using out-of-date resources. So I've already touched upon this a bit, and it's easy to do this when you are finding random articles from Google. It's very easy to find ones that are out of date and which can therefore give you the wrong answer. Tax rules change all the time, so we need to be very careful that we're using resources that are up to date. So an example of where I've seen out of date resources used is in relation to the furlough rules that came out around March time last year, right at the start of coronavirus. So the scheme has changed so many times since it's been introduced, and without boring you and going into the details about it, all you need to know is that there's probably 5 or 6 different variations of the scheme where there's slightly different rules with each one. So when I asked someone to go and find the answer to some furlough questions for me, they started off by going to the wrong direction, which is where the legislation is for the furlough scheme. They ended up going to one which is out of date, And so when they did their research and they analysed it and they came to their conclusion, they came to a conclusion which was right for that piece of guidance and that direction, but it just wasn't right for the current version of the scheme. So if we would have gone and given advice based on that, we would have ended up giving the wrong answer to a client. So you can see why you need to be so careful when using resources to make sure that they are up to date and they are the right ones for the time period that you're looking at. So some typical resources that can be out of date, that they are the random articles that you can find on Google from a non-credible source. Physical material and books are something that can become out of date very easily, which is why so many book publishers like Tolly's will publish books every single year to take into account the new rule changes. So don't be using one from 2016 when you're looking at a period in 2019. Make sure you're using the one that covers a period in 2019. Government's online legislation resource as well is actually quite shockingly bad for being out of date, particularly for tax rules. They don't tend to update it, but they will have some form of note on each page that says this legislation is out of date and here's the new legislation. But you usually have to try and piece it all together. So it's always best to use some up-to-date legislation books like Tolly's or some online resource that your employer might have paid for, which will cover that. So there are some typical resources that can be out of date. So whenever you're using those, always be particularly careful and make sure that you are using one that is up to date. And if you're not, go and find the resources that are up to date. The third sin is taking guidance out of context or in isolation without understanding the full picture. So this is something that I've been aware of for quite a long time now, and I'm always so careful to not take anything out of context or just in isolation. I always try and understand the full picture. But fairly recently, actually, I saw a circumstance where this wasn't done and therefore the wrong answer was reached. So the scenario was a director of a company got himself a lease car in his own name but was paying all the lease payments from the company. And the question basically was, will that car be a car benefit on the director because the company's covering all the costs, or will it just be cast as a personal car, therefore no tax benefit on the car itself, but will the payments that the company's been making on behalf of the director just be taxable payments on the director? So the person who was doing the research for this found a page in HMRC's Employment Income Manual that seemed to deal with the question. And if you've ever used HMRC guidance, they tend to keep linking to different pages, etc., to provide more information. And they took one sentence from one of the manual pages, they thought it meant something, which it didn't, and they kept clicking through, to different pages up until they came to a page which they thought gave them the right answer. The problem was that first sentence that they started on was ambiguous, and without understanding the full situation or the criteria that need to be met in order for there to be a car benefit, then that sentence would not be understood properly. So what the person should have done in this scenario was they should have took a step back, they should have looked at all the conditions that need to apply in order for there to be a car benefit, and that would have helped them to appreciate the context more of that single sentence that was a little bit ambiguous. And if they would have done that, they would have been more likely to have come to the right answer. But because they didn't, and they jumped straight into one page about car benefits without firstly understanding the full picture, they ended up unfortunately coming to the wrong answer. So that's a lesson that they would have learned, which I'm sure they won't do again now, but it's something that can be very easily done. So never ever rely on one page from some HMRC guidance or a single sentence. Firstly, understand the full picture. This is particularly important with guidance from HMRC because they tend to not use the most precise wording at times, so you really need to understand the context in order to understand the guidance. So when doing the research, you should go back to the fundamentals of the rules first. So that is all the conditions that you're looking at before looking at a single condition in isolation, because that way you'll be able to fully understand what you're looking at. The fourth sin is not following through definitions of words fully, or taking a definition of a word for granted or assuming what it means. So in tax rules, there tend to be very specific definitions given to certain words, and if you don't understand that actual specific definition, then you could end up coming to the wrong answer. And assuming that you understand what one of these words are is just dangerous. You're so unlikely to get it right, just because even within one set of tax legislation, a definition in relation to one set of rules could be different to the definition of the same words in a different one. So you need to be exceptionally careful when it comes to this. So one of the examples I have from employment taxes of following definitions all the way through to the end is where you start with something like pay-as-you-earn income, and that is income that needs to be taxed through the pay-as-you-earn system. You start off by looking at the definition of pay-as-you-earn income, and one of the things that counts as pay-as-you-earn income is pay-as-you-earn employment income. You then look at what the definition of pay-as-you-earn employment income is, and that consists of two things: taxable earnings and taxable specific income. Let's just take the taxable earnings part of that as an example. So the definition of taxable earnings relies on the definition of general earnings. General earnings is earnings or other amounts treated as earnings. So in order to understand what general earnings are, you need to understand what earnings are, and then you also need to understand what amounts treated as earnings are. And only once you've followed through all of those definitions and understood each and every one of them can you truly understand what pay-as-you-earn income is and get the correct answer there. And within probably about the first 18 months of working in tax, there were some changes that came in that changed how expenses can be paid to employees without them needing to be taxed or declared to HMRC. And in order to fully understand the legislation changes that have been made and how those changes resulted in the answer being what HMRC was stating, I needed to understand the full definition of pay-as-you-earn income, and I needed to be able to follow it through. But at the time, I didn't do that, and it was just making it a nightmare in terms of not being able to see how what HMRC was saying was the answer. But now, in hindsight, if I'd have just followed these definitions through fully and understood each and every one of them, I would have understood that. But that was a lesson that I'd learned from that, and it's definitely something that I do all the time now. So hopefully that demonstrates anyway the importance of making sure that you understand definitions and that you follow them all the way through to each other definition where they rely on multiple ones. It's a bit like a spider web almost, that you keep branching out and have to keep following another definition, but once you've followed it all the way through, you can then understand everything properly. And without doing that, you can see how you could easily come to the incorrect answer. So the example that I've given here is one where there's kind of that spider web of definitions that just seems to keep chaining and having more and more definitions to rely upon. But that's not always the case. Sometimes it could just be one word or one phrase that's defined, and that will be given a specific definition either in the part of the legislation that you're looking at or somewhere around that. But the point that I want you to take away anyway is do not take the definition of a word in tax for granted. Check whether there's a specific definition for it, and if there is, make sure that you understand it and follow it all the way through if that's necessary. Also, there's times when you're doing tax research, when you're looking at guidance or legislation, where you could come across a word that you don't fully understand, or you're not quite sure if you do understand it or not. And in this case, I urge you to not just assume or guess that you know what the definition is. Go and check and make sure that you are understanding that word, because otherwise you could end up coming to the opposite answer to the one that is correct. And so in these cases, I will just use an online dictionary. There's a few words that I always go and check, even though I feel like I do know what they mean. I always like to double check just in case. And that one, and two of those are notwithstanding. I'm always careful and go and double check with that one. And another one is the word furtherance, which is used in VAT legislation. It's quite archaic, very old-fashioned English, and it's one that I always have to be careful when I'm looking at to make sure that I am fully following exactly what it means. There's no shame in going to check the definition of a word or even asking a colleague, etc., because at the end of the day, you want to come to the right answer, and if you don't check what the meaning of the word is and you end up coming to the wrong answer, that's going to be probably more embarrassing than having to go and check the definition of a word. The fifth sin is assuming that you know the answer to a question based on some different research that you've done or some different tax knowledge that you have. So an example that I have from employment taxes again is there's two sets of rules that people, I suppose, commonly understand as being affected where there's a salary sacrifice of some sort of pay in return for something else like expenses or benefits. We tend to refer to them as the expenses exemption in employment taxes and the optional remuneration rules. So both of them kind of rely on this concept of salary sacrifice. But within the expenses exemption, there's this definition of salary sacrifice arrangements, and within the optional remuneration rules, there's this definition of optional remuneration arrangements, which is trying to get at salary sacrifice arrangements too. But as you can guess, given that I'm giving this as an example, both of the definitions are actually different. And although salary sacrifice under one of them could be caught under the definition of another, that is definitely not a given. And if you were to assume that, you would come to the wrong answer in some cases. So if you were to assume that they had the exact same definition, you would end up giving incorrect advice in some circumstances. So the point here is, do not assume the definition of something is the same as the definition for another piece of legislation. Always go back to the basics, check what the definition is for the specific rules that you're working with now, and only then can you come to the answer properly. Otherwise, you'll just open yourself up for risk of getting the wrong answer. The sixth sin is a little controversial probably, but it is using only HMRC guidance. So I know that a lot of people will rely on just HMRC guidance, and personally I think that is a sin, and I will come in to tell you why. So HMRC guidance, contrary to what a lot of people seem to think, it is not the law. It is HMRC's interpretation of the law. So whilst if you were to follow guidance and do what HMRC say, it wouldn't be contested by HMRC, you could end up actually giving your client or someone else a disservice by just relying on it. Because HMRC are inevitably going to put a position out there which leads to more tax being collected than one where they would get less. And if you were to go straight to the legislation, in a lot of cases there's ambiguities or even clearly times where HMRC guidance could be incorrect. So if you were to just use HMRC guidance, you wouldn't give yourself the opportunity to spot more beneficial routes for a client or someone else. So when I first started working in tax, I seem to remember this one person in particular trying to drum home that we should always use the legislation when doing tax research. And because it's a difficult thing to do, it's not easy wording to read, a lot of people tend to just not do that and go to the guidance because it's easier. But I kind of took it upon myself to take that ethos as fact and to apply it to the research that I do. So now whenever I'm doing tax research, I always try to start with the legislation, and if for some reason I have no clue where to start and I can't find it, then I will go elsewhere, but I'll always come back to legislation. And that for one has put me in a pretty unique position, I would say, in terms of doing research, because a lot of people don't do that, so it's helped me build a really good skill. But it also means, for me anyway, that I can always give the best advice possible to a client. So I just want to give an example of where HMRC guidance says something which the legislation doesn't necessarily agree with, and that is that HMRC say within their guidance, I'm pretty sure, that all directors of a UK company must submit a tax return. And I'm pretty sure that, at least when I looked a few years ago with some colleagues, that that's not necessarily true, and it's arguable whether that is the correct position or not. But if you were to take just HMRC's guidance, then you would be telling any clients that you have that are directors of a company that they must submit a tax return. Whereas if you looked at the legislation as well, let's just assume that what I've just said is true at least, then you could advise the client that whilst HMRC's position is that all directors should submit a tax return, actually there's scope within the legislation to argue differently, and then you can help the client make a choice whether they want to follow HMRC's guidance or not. And whilst I understand in this case, it's most likely that the client is just going to file a tax return because that's the safer option, and it's probably not going to be that much effort, at least if their affairs are simple. You've given them the choice, you've given them the full picture, and that way the client cannot ever think that you have given them a disservice by relying on HMRC guidance. Just to round off this section, if you can, I would always suggest starting with legislation rather than HMRC's guidance, and that's because if you start with HMRC's guidance, you could end up tainting your interpretation of the legislation because you're already going in thinking that the legislation is going to mean one thing. Whereas if you went in with a blank mind without looking at HMRC guidance first, then there's no way that your interpretation could be tainted. Then what you can do after you've looked at the legislation is compare your outcome back to what HMRC's guidance says, and if it matches up, great, you know that you agree with HMRC and that's going to be the advice that you can give. But if it doesn't, then you can try and understand why that is. Could it be because you've misinterpreted something, or could it be that there's actually a different interpretation to what HMRC is putting out there in its guidance? The seventh sin is basing results on assumptions without making it clear that you are taking these assumptions. So if you weren't to take any assumptions or try and fully establish the facts before you do a piece of research, then you could end up having lots of different possibilities, and it could take a very long time to do the research, and it could also take a long time to give the advice or to write up your findings. And so whilst it would be best to try and establish the facts first so that you can go down the right avenue straight away, sometimes for whatever reason that might not be possible, and so you can start making some assumptions. However, if you make assumptions, then you need to make it absolutely clear that the way that you have come to that conclusion is by making certain assumptions, because if those assumptions turn out to be incorrect, then the advice you give could end up being incorrect. So just kind of a story about this is someone was doing some research around the trivial benefits legislation for employment taxes, which in short means that benefits given to staff that are less than £50 or no more than £50 per head could be exempt from tax, provided that certain conditions are met. One of those conditions is that the benefit needs to not have been given in recognition of any particular services or in recognition of services that are going to be provided in the future, essentially. I mean, that's not the exact wording of it, but that's the gist of it. And when doing this research for this client question, they assumed that the benefits in question did meet that criteria, but when they were writing up the conclusion and the answer, they didn't state that. And so if this piece of advice was sent to a client, then there's a chance that they could end up coming to the wrong result, because what if that assumption turned out to be incorrect? And even if it was correct for this circumstance, the client could take that advice to a different scenario and apply it, but not realising that there's an assumption in there, they could come to a wrong answer in the future. So that's obviously dangerous for multiple reasons. So if you are going to make assumptions when doing research, make that clear and ratify them if possible. If you can't, of course, get the correct facts up front, which is always going to be the best scenario. If you are going to be making an assumption, check it, or at least state it, so then whoever's receiving the piece of advice can tell you whether or not that assumption is a correct one or not. The eighth sin is not documenting or justifying how you've come to a conclusion. And if you don't do this as you go along, it is just going to be so time consuming to go back and do this again. So you might as well do it as you go along. But why do you need to justify or document how you've come to a conclusion? Well, if you're giving advice to a client, you might not need to actually tell them how you've come to that conclusion or justify it to them in the piece of advice, but you'll probably want something on file in case it's ever questioned or you need to be able to justify it in the future, whether that's because HMRC is challenging it or someone else is challenging it. Then you'll want to be able to justify it without having to go through and do the whole piece of research again. There could be another scenario where a colleague has asked you to do some research and they need to check your conclusion and make sure that you've arrived at one that's correct. They will need to see how you've come to that conclusion. So justifying it and noting it down is the way to do that, whether that's stating the pages of HMRC manuals that you've used and how you've come to the conclusion using those, or whether it's quoting the legislation. Whatever it is, being able to justify it and justifying it is something that I think is important, and definitely more important where there's a scenario where the answer isn't a black and white one where it's grey, because in those cases you're going to have to say why it's grey, the two possibilities and why you think it's one or the other, or the fact that you think both are justifiable. Whatever it is, documenting it and justifying it is important, so make sure you do it. What I tend to do now, because when I first started working in tax, I ended up doing the same pieces of research multiple times for different clients. or very similar research at least, it ended up becoming quite time consuming. I'd already done it before, and it felt like a waste of time to keep doing the same thing time and time again, because it can take a long time to do tax research, and you'll know that if you've ever had to do any on something that isn't straightforward. So what I did to, I suppose, address that is I thought I'm now just going to keep like a folder full of all the research that I've done, so then if I need to do similar or the same research again, I either have the answer ready or I have all the resources there already, and that means I won't have to go and refine them. And you'll be surprised the amount of time that this has actually saved me. There's so many times where I can't remember the exact piece of legislation or the exact piece of guidance, and if I go to my folder that I've organised nicely and spent time creating, I can go and find it straight away. It saves me so much time, and it also makes it easier for asking colleagues to do research at times, because I can say, I think I've done something similar to that before, here's the folder, you can take a look there as a starting point, and then even if it isn't exactly what they need, they've got a good starting point. Also, where I've done some research where I've come to a complicated, that's been complicated and it's been difficult to come to the answer, what I will do is I will just very briefly note down how I've got to the answer or what I think the answer is, to save me having to go through all that thought process again. So that's usually the case where you have to follow through legislation to lots of different parts, rather than just there be one page that clearly states the answer. Because if you've got one page that clearly states the answer, whether that's in legislation or in HMRC guidance, then there's no need to justify it, because it'll be obvious from that. But where you've had to piece something together, noting down how you piece together the answer is going to save time in the future. You could also forget how you actually came to that conclusion at the time, and you might not be able to come to the same conclusion again. If that's the case, particularly where like the legislation is grey, that can happen. Documenting it down at the time will mean that you can fully understand how you reach that answer. So those are all things that I do now anyway. I call it my tax research library. So that's where I keep all my research, whether it's tax or things that are related to tax. And it has saved me so much time. I cannot emphasise the amount of time this has saved me over the last few years. In summary then, for this episode, the 8 sins are using random online articles from Googling or similar, using out-of-date resources, taking guidance out of context or in isolation without understanding the full picture, not following through definitions of words or taking them for granted or assuming what they mean, assuming that you know the answer to a question based on some different research that you've done or some different tax knowledge. Never assume that something for one set of tax rules is going to be the same in the different around definitions in particular. Using only HMRC guidance. Basing a conclusion on assumptions without making it clear that you've done this. Not documenting or justifying how you've come to a conclusion. If you would like to also learn about the things that you should do in order to undertake tax research effectively, you can listen to episode 1 of the podcast at thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/TTPP1. The show notes for this episode also include further related episodes of the podcast, which you may find helpful, and you can access the show notes at thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/TTPP26. If you like this episode, then make sure that you don't miss out on any future episodes that will help you to progress, develop, and improve your tax career by signing up for email notifications at thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/subscribe. These will give you a brief summary of each episode so that you can decide if you want to listen. Episodes are bi-weekly and are released on Mondays. But that's it for this episode. I hope you liked the episode and have taken away some useful points to help you progress, develop, and improve your tax career. Until next time.